This is an examination of Shaul's letter to the ecclesia in Rome, written in approximately 58 AD, nearly 3 decades into the reign of the Messiah's kingdom. We'll look at this letter verse by verse, reading its context and discovering its message. I prefer to implement a systematic verse-by-verse explanation, taking into consideration historical context, the personal circumstances of the writer and the hearers, along with the Greek text and its idioms, as well as the culture of the day. We must perceive these writings through the eyes of those living the events and dealing with the day's issues. We need to understand these letters as if we were there when Shaul spoke and wrote these very words. What was going on around him? An honest pursuit of truth carries with it blessings, and freedom is one of those blessings. John 8:32. To understand Shaul's writings, we need to get to know him to some degree. Familiarity with Shaul's background and writing style will naturally help a great deal to get into his way of thinking. That type of familiarity only comes from time spent reading his letters and considering his involvement, his motives, his background, and the problems that he faced from one day to the next. Ancient mysticism and outright paganism has become pervasive and entrenched in Christianity today. No one sees it because they haven't been taught what it is. Not even the preachers know. The biggest problem is that I don't think people truly care one way or the other. The church is a free social club. It's a place where people gather to promote themselves to each other and attempt to fill an emptiness down inside, but they can't. Mythical lies have replaced truth, and now these lies are totally accepted as doctrine. Consequently, everyone is now a victim of these lies, myths, absurdity, and deceptive doctrines that are being perpetrated today. One lady mentioned, to my shock, that churches today fail to even address the Spirit. And through my own observation, I'm witnessing organizations abandoning the Messiah and choosing to try to go straight to the Father. The Messiah is the only way to the Father. No man comes to the Father except through YHWH. No other way. If you try to get to the Father any other way, you're a thief and a robber. You're climbing over the walls. This letter, the book of Romans, this letter to the ecclesia at Rome, appears first among Shaul's letters as they appear in the English versions of the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. However, chronologically, this letter was not the first of Shaul's writings. Shaul wrote this letter to the ecclesia at Rome, again in approximately 58 AD, which would have been nearly 30 years after YHWH was raised immortal. At this point in time, YHWH had been reigning on his throne for almost 30 years. Now, there are going to be some that are going to be curious about what I'm saying here. We have another video, another podcast coming up. We already have a video, but we're going to do a podcast just on this alone at some point. Before writing this letter to the ecclesia, the called out believers in Rome or at Rome, Shaul had already written a letter to Galatia about 10 years earlier. He had also written 2 letters to the called out ecclesia in Corinth and 2 additional letters to the ecclesia in Thessalonica. Shaul wrote this letter to Rome while he was in Corinth on his 3rd excursion into Asia Minor and Europe. His travels are today commonly called missionary journeys. In these excursions to the west from Palestine, Shaul took the gospel of the new kingdom to the Israel people in Asia Minor and in Europe. We noted from the Acts lessons that after Shaul's 3rd missionary trip, after he wrote this letter to the Romans, he returned to Jerusalem to intercept more of his fellow kinsmen who might be in the area during the upcoming scheduled holy day. While there, the Judeans arrested him and transported him to Rome as a prisoner. Shaul had wanted to go to Rome, but not under those circumstances. Nonetheless, YHWH had his agenda for Shaul. Shaul's letter was delivered to the called out ecclesia at Rome, probably by one of Shaul's friends, a lady by the name of Phoebe. Shaul in Romans chapter 16, he mentions her name. In verse 1, he says, I am commending to you Phoebe, our sister, who is also a servant to the called out ecclesia, which is at Cenchrea, that you might welcome her in the Messiah as becomes saints, and that you stand by her in whatever matter she may need of you. For she also has been a caretaker of many, and of myself also. This letter that Shaul penned to the ecclesia mixed among the Romans is unique in his writing, as it was his most complete writing. Most New Testament letters, except for the 4 Gospels, were written by Shaul. This particular letter addressed a broad spectrum of issues and touched upon a host of doctrinal questions. If we only had access to one of Shaul's letters, this letter to the ecclesia in Rome would be the best choice because its teachings are complete and they're formal. Shaul's letter to the Roman ecclesia teaches doctrine and principles. He doesn't merely state doctrine, he explains it, and then he justifies it. This letter also examines the elements of law, faith, and works. In the writings of Romans, Shaul puts those 3 elements in perspective. Using his particular method of explanation, he answers questions about Israel's existence in the world, her purpose, and the reasons for the problems that she had and that she was experiencing. This particular letter that Shaul wrote to the ecclesia in Rome was written well into the New Kingdom reign of Messiah. This was an era when dramatic and profound events and changes were occurring. Shaul found himself engaged in an age of transitional events resulting from the Messiah's new kingdom. YHWH had conscripted Shaul into his service. Shaul had become one of the Messiah's main instruments to deliver and preach to the dispersed Israelites in the Gentile regions, in this case specifically in Rome.